hear what he says now, and I think it'll be good for all of us. Out here, I think we're moving these tables, but there are tables with some books for sale and some DVDs. And if you're a Disciples of Christ minister, there's been a request to gather afterwards for a little bit of a photo op. But for now, I'm just going to turn it over to my good friend, Reverend Dr. Ted Smith.
For the invitation to be here, and thanks to all of you who actually came back. This is always encouraging. There are books back there. If you don't have money, just take one and read it and help yourself. That'll be fine. But let me tell you which ones do which. If you're really interested in the transition from Puritan preaching to the preaching of the 19th century, the book for that is The New Measures. That's where I was writing about that. If you're interested in this overview of history, basically what I've been giving this morning, that's thinking about all these institutions, that's in the first 3 chapters of a book called The End of Theological Education. It's more accessible in the digest. So most of today's stuff is coming out of those 2 books. The End of Theological Education especially thinks about theological education and all this, but it's built out of the same social theory. And then there's just other books that are about other things. So you can check them out if you're interested. All right. So if you were to look at this pattern of affiliation in the U.S., remember, I know you all know now, 1776, what's the affiliation level in the U.S.? 17%, right? So what happens over the course of the 19th century is that the voluntary associations that emerge, these really fit the times. People love them. They work. They feel right. People go and it feels like they belong. It feels meaningful. They feel caught up in something larger than themselves. This social imaginary is super robust. And so throughout the 19th century and really into the 1950s, you see that pattern of religious affiliation in the U.S. just go up, 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 up. And then in the 60s, it starts to decline. And then in the last, or kind of level off with some evangelical spikes and spikes from immigration, but then it's really kind of falling off the cliff in the last decade. So why is that happening? Why is that happening? First of all, I want to give 2 things that are not happening. You all might, one thing that is not happening is that we are not part of a world historical process of secularization, in which the rise of science and rationality just means that people automatically become less religious. There are many pieces of evidence that would defy this. One is that modernization has actually led to growing religious affiliation in Korea, in Brazil, in West Africa. So it's not like modernity up, religion down. That pattern has not held, right, around the world. A second thing that I would point to is a whole cluster of places where you see this intense kind of spiritual, but not religious, not ecclesial energy, but still tarot cards are selling better than they've ever sold in the history of the world. It's not like we're entering this hyper-rational age. Astrology is just common talk among all kinds of younger generations. Self-help, productivity apps, Headspace, mindfulness apps, Soul Cycle, your CrossFit gym is like your little church. You're seeing these energies still in the culture. The energies are still there. What they don't want to do is to migrate into a voluntary association and start to serve on the Christian Education Committee, right? That's not where those energies are going. But it's not a secularizing that's happening. Here's another thing that's not happening. For decades now, I've been hearing variations on the argument that somehow liberalism, however that's defined, was the reason why people were leaving the church. But you've got to see that this decline is across all parts of the church, across all, Protestant, Catholic, evangelical, liberal, mainline. So in 2020, and the Southern Baptist Convention reported its 14th year in a row of declining membership. And the largest single year decline is in the most recent year in the membership in the last 100 years. And the rate of baptisms, which is more something to tell us about the future of the church, is declining even more precipitously. And when I get to congregations, I'm going to talk about some congregational exceptions, some places where numerical growth is still happening, but it doesn't track with liberal conservative kind of things. This is really spectrum wide. All right. So those things aren't happening. It's not just a liberal disease, and it's also not a world historical process of secularization. So what is it? Well, there's going to be no monocausal, and forgive me, that's probably a $10 word. There's no one single explanation, and if you try to offer one, then it's going to be foolish, right? We've got a generational replacement. There's a decline in sanction for not affiliating with church. In my hometown, if you wanted to, Springfield, Missouri, buckle of the Bible Belt, Queen City of the Ozarks, if you want to run for office in Springfield, Missouri, you better be an usher at one of about 4 churches, and you better be there to shake hands with folks on Sunday morning. When I grew up. Now, you don't have to be part of a church. You can still be a respectable member of society. So that's a real shift. If you wanted to do business, you better be a member. The social sanction has gone away. And that's one reason we're seeing the decline even faster, is that people used to even, exaggerate their church membership to poll takers because it was so disreputable to say they weren't part of anything. So they'd say, I'm part of Peachtree Christian, even if they hadn't been here in 20 years, because they just didn't want to think of them. But now they just say, no, I don't go anywhere, right? So the social sanction has declined. People are turned off by the politics in the church, they say. They're also turned on by real politics. They're like, why go to church as a way to do activism? If what I want to do is activism, I'm just going to go do activism. Sometimes the church teachings seem too exclusive to people, especially younger people, especially around sexuality. But sometimes the church teaching's so watered down in what the sociologist Christian Smith called moralistic therapeutic deism that there's no point to go to church. If all it's going to do is tell you what you can get from Brene Brown, why not just listen to Brene Brown? She's interesting. So it's both of these things. It's also the case that what sociologists have dubbed greedy professions take time. It takes a lot of time to do many of the kinds of work in our society right now. Work is just colonizing more and more of our lives. We induct our children into this with the youth sports industrial complex. It takes more and more of their lives from an early age. And you cannot discount the role of sexual abuse by clergy as you think about reasons why people are leaving. And if we as a church don't face that, and we pretend it's all these factors beyond us, we're not telling the truth. All of these things are going on. But what I want to do is to try to point to, I think of these in some ways like froth on the surface of the river. What I want to try to point to is what I think is a deep, powerful current that is really pushing things along under the river. And these are the 2 data points I want you to look at to define this. The first of them is that we had in the U.S., you saw this huge flourishing of all these voluntary associations, not just churches, but other voluntary associations are things like Scouts, Rotary, Junior League, Masons, Elks, Shriners, all of these. Every kind of voluntary association in the United States right now is in some kind of crisis. All are suffering from losses of membership. That's true for ones that are explicitly religious, and that's true for ones that don't seem very religious at all. So now you start to think, okay, maybe the issue is the form of the voluntary association and not the nature of the religion. Here's the second data point that I think does a lot to push this, and that is that religious beliefs and practices are persisting, even growing, beyond the bounds of voluntary associations. This is what I was pointing to with all the kind of New Agey stuff, but it's also Christian stuff that is flourishing outside of congregations. People finding different ways to get what they need. And I think in a way, being a member of a congregation but commuting digitally, it's a sort of halfway house, right? When we attend in that way, this is a place where the pandemic has accelerated it. So what I think we're seeing is less a decline in religious belief and practice, and more a change in the relationship of individuals to institutions. A move from what I want to call this age of association, the age of voluntary associations, to an age that stresses individual authenticity or authentic individuals. So again, all the disclaimers, ages always get everything wrong. It's going to be oversimplifying. But I do think we're in a time between the times. Those revivals in the 18th century helped break up the standing order, and the church had to adapt to get to voluntary associations. Now we're in a time when the voluntary associations that have ordered religious life in the United States are coming unraveled. And that's happening across the board. We're really entering a new sort of social imaginary. I want to describe that as a process of individualization. Individualization. And again, here I want you to hear my ambivalence, and around individualization, I'm probably not just ambivalent, I'm deeply counter to it, but this is the way the world in which we live is ordered now. I'm borrowing that term individualization from the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, and I use it instead of individualism because I think a lot of times individualism, which has been more common among American commentators, it can make it sound like this social imaginary with the individual at the center, can make it sound like this is an ideology that we choose to hold, right? So, you believe in Methodism and you believe in individualism, right? That it's another view that we would hold. But what individualization points out is that individualism isn't just something that we believe on our own, it is something that is happening to us, that is pressed upon us through powerful material disciplinary forces. We are just individualized by social, political, and economic forces of our time. Let me give you one very material example. The old pension model, right? If you would have a pension where you shared in the long-term profits of a company, you were kind of a member of that, right? But not anymore. Now you've got an individual 401k that travels with you, right? We've individualized that process in a pretty radical way. That changes your life. It changes. It's an individualizing that's very powerful. So too. It's not just, you can go across the economy and just name all of the different ways that happens. It's there in people, like my dad worked for the same construction company for my entire life. And then he retired from that company. Almost nobody today is going to work for the same company for that whole time, right? Instead, you're told you need to create your own brand. You are your brand. You are your own corporation. This is true even for pastors. So you need to kind of build your identity, and then you retail your individual identity. These are strong changes in the way the economy functions. Another place we see it, I think, is in sports teams. Like the free agency model has gone from professional teams, now it's down to college and even to high school, right? The individual has a place in a way that the team just becomes a platform for individual performance. And we see that in the church as well, where the pastor, many pastors are not kind of servants of the voluntary association building the association. Rather, the congregation is the platform on which they stand as they build their own personal brand. So we see this individualization running throughout all these spheres of society. And as the parent of a 17-year-old, I want to name one of the more subtle ways that it happens. It happens in those college admissions essays. What you have to do is to tell the story of yourself. You have to narrate yourself as an individual, and you need to do it in a winsome way. This is really different than other ways of sorting who will get into these institutions. So individualization, it's happening everywhere. One of the things I want to point out about it is if individualism is this kind of idea that we have that, it's the primacy of the individual and we want to celebrate this. If that's the case, then the right response might be to scold people who are individualists and to tell them you need to be less narcissistic. like Christopher Lasch. You need to be less self-absorbed. You need to think about the community. And that's the form that most critiques of individualism have taken. If, on the other hand, individualization is a complex set of economic, political, and social forces that make people into individuals, whether they like it or not, then the correct response is not to try to scold them into being something else. The correct response is compassion for how hard it is to be an individualized individual in the 21st century America. Now, here's an interest when I was really thinking about, and this has been the biggest shift in my thinking as I wrote this most recent book. I used to think about church decline or nuns primarily as yuppies at brunch, right? They want to go to brunch instead of going to church. They're decadent, they're selfish, they're narcissistic, and what we need to do is to get them back to caring about something larger than themselves. But when you look at who is not going to church in America, when you look at the nuns, it varies perfectly with class and income status. The more likely the higher income and social status level, the more likely they are to be part of a congregation. The less income and status that they have, the less likely. Now, this is contrary to some of our myths about, hardworking, poor people are more devout. They may be more devout, but they don't have time to go to church because they're working 3 jobs, or they're ashamed to go to church because somebody's going to show up and say, well, what are you doing? You're not dressed quite right. Any number, and are just not having the kind of life that's organized in that direction. But this to me is something that the church really has to reckon with right now. What does it mean that membership in a voluntary association has become something like a luxury good? What does it mean that it's become distributed with class and income? I think what it means is that old dispensation is the one to which those who have more right now are better adjusted, and so that world still fits for them. But people who've undergone extensive individualizing processes, who are like gig workers, right? Uber drivers or TaskRabbit workers, the gig economy, they're not formed to join voluntary associations, so it feels like a foreign world. These things are why I want to really stress that what's happening here is not individualism as an ideal, but it's individualization as a set of powerful social processes that are happening, and they are especially intense on younger people, on younger generations. And they're especially intense on people who don't have the economic and cultural power to resist them. We're seeing that throughout society. So if that process of individualization is at work, one of the core values of the individualized individual, a value that is pressed upon people, is the value of authenticity. So you'll hear this all the time. It shows up in surveys and in other kinds of conversations or focus groups with people today. When you talk about what they value most, it's this authenticity. And I think authenticity is a kind of fuzzy word. It's a magic word that carries a lot of what it means to figure out how to have a life in this individualized status. I could talk a lot about it. We can play it out some more, but I just want you to hold on to that as a kind of magic word. And by magic, I just mean it's one of those words that when you say it today, no one argues with that. Nobody's going to say, oh, I'm really against authenticity. I mean, I understand you're for it, but no, I'm not down with authenticity, right? So when a word becomes like that no one could, and when it can take on all kinds of different meanings, that's what I mean by a magic word. So it's a kind of magic word right now. And I think that's again, back to the social theorist Theodor Adorno, he saw that happening in late modern Europe, and his argument is that this is the kind of, here you'll forgive me, there's a whole bunch of $10 words coming, but it's like the ideological compensation for the individualization that's produced by the economy. Like you You might not have a pension plan anymore, but you can be yourself. You can be your real self now. You're emancipated, right? So you don't have to go to IBM and wear a gray suit every day and do something boring like have salary and healthcare and pension. You get to be a gig worker, and you get to do anything you want, and you can wake up when you want, and you can be yourself. Do you see what I mean? Do you see here the mode in which authenticity can be a kind of ideological compensation for individualization? That's the sentence. Authenticity is an ideological compensation for the process of individualization. Churches are caught up in this whether we want to be or not. So what does this mean for congregations and for preaching? The last thing I ever want to do is to move from sociology into marketing consultant for churches, right? That is not the role that I want to play. The role that I do want to play is to try to do some of this social analysis in an ecclesial space with fellow Christians and try to say, what is God doing in a moment like this? And how do we respond? And discerning what God is doing is not the same thing as developing a really good marketing plan, right? Discerning what God is doing, this is a God who works through the cross, right? So it's a deeper kind of discernment, but we've got to be attuned to what's actually happening on the ground in order to do it. All right, so congregations first. One of the things we're seeing is that there is less participation in congregations overall. So just before the pandemic, the average Protestant congregation in the U.S., anybody want to guess the size of the average Protestant congregation? 77, it's measured in many ways. 65 but it's in that range. That's right. So here's the other thing, and that's down from 137 just 20 years ago. So we're seeing a decline, a really steep decline in the size of the average congregation. All right, so one of the things that's happening in congregations is that most of them are becoming smaller. In my own PCUSA, before the pandemic, 60% of congregations were under 100 members. So you've got a whole bunch of really small congregations out there. At the same time, so most of the congregations are small, but most of the members are in large congregations. And we're seeing this trend continue. The small congregations are getting smaller, and in many cases, the big congregations are getting bigger. And even when they're not getting bigger, they have a larger percentage of the total number of people in that denomination within the jurisdiction. So again, to give you PCUSA numbers, I'm sure the disciple numbers are similar. Almost a third of all members of the Presbyterian Church USA, almost a third, are in about 4% of the congregations. Just take that in. Like the vast majority of the members are in just a few congregations. And over 50% of the members are in about an eighth of the congregations. So you get over 50% of the total membership of the church in a relatively small number of congregations. So what are the takeaways here? We've got a polarization in the U.S. between very large and very small congregations. It's like what's happening it's what's happening with businesses too. The middle is disappearing. Very large is working, and there's a lot of very small. The thing I want to point to is that both very large and very small congregations function less like voluntary societies. By this I mean a very large congregation, especially as they evolve, and a megachurch leans into this. A lot of the megachurches of today the fastest growing ones don't even have a concept of membership. You don't even have to become being a member isn't even the ideal. You just kind of come and you experience it, you do it, right? Membership is not the number that they track. But even if you do join, a megachurch, the kind of megachurch that's growing, it's not run by its members. The members don't have this elaborate committee structure that runs everything. It's very much a top-down corporate structure, right? That's really different. It's a different kind of organization than a voluntary association. In the same time, and so there's a shift in ethos from volunteers to staff, because when people come to the institution, when they come to church, they don't find it meaningful to sustain the voluntary association. They don't want to give their time. And here, if you're in this room, you're probably an exception to this, right? I'm an exception to this because I was raised differently. You probably are too. But you know how hard it is to recruit people to do these things now, right? Because I feel this difference between my parents' generation and my children, all of whom are all of these folks are believers, right? But for my parents, it was profoundly meaningful to serve on any committee of our local church, because the church was of infinite importance, that voluntary association, and it was directly connected to God's work in the world. So even if you're on the Buildings and Grounds Committee of the church, right? Even if you're on that, you are doing God's work because you're sustaining God's institution. And so that's a meaningful life. But to my kids, they want to go to church, mostly, but they don't want to serve on a committee like that. And their generational peers who are less weird and raised by weird parents, they're not like that at all, right? They don't want to come and serve on a committee to sustain the institution. If they go at all, when they go, they want to work on themselves. They want to do things that are meaningful for their kind of personal growth and development. Now, those things might be narcissistic, really focused on the self, but it could also be, I want to participate in really meaningful hands-on service kinds of things that are out there. I want to be involved in intense movements for justice. I'm not really so much interested in sustaining the institutional apparatus. Now, that is a real shift in mindset. The voluntary association, social imaginary, the voluntary association is kind of what anchors meaning in the world, right? So sustaining it just is meaningful. With this age of authentic individuals, the voluntary association, if people are members of it at all, it's to serve their projects of authenticity. Do you see that? That shift is, I think, one of the deep things that's happening now. I think the church sometimes, some of the really quick-growing megachurches just capitulate to this, right? And they just want to serve in an uncritical way these really expressive moments, this kind of work of meaning-making. I don't think we need to do that, but we have got to take seriously what's going on here, take seriously the felt desire for this life project of putting together an identity in a world that doesn't tell you who you are or how you should live. Putting together an identity is really crucial work right now. And it's really hard work to do when you're individualized in the ways that we are. Connecting with other people is really hard to do right now. And so people come for connection, and they come for that work of becoming an individual. The church can critique these things even as we invite people into deeper processes of them. So the interesting thing to me is that really large churches are doing this in one way. The other place it's happening is in really small churches. By this, I don't mean the 65-member church that's still trying to pretend like it has 250 members and is therefore sustaining all of its committee structure and burning everybody out. And when somebody new walks through the door, they descend on them like vampires to see if they can draw the blood from them to sustain the... You know this church, right? It's not that. What I mean are churches that are intentionally small. I hope he won't mind my outing him here, but even a great leader of the Church of the Voluntary Association like Tom Long, Fred Craddock's successor in the bandy preaching chair, is now part of a house church. Well, why be part of a house church? Well, because it just feels more meaningful. And we pass around the preaching. What you have, the interesting thing that happens with the very small, intentionally small, and the very large congregations is that in both of them, you have minimal institutional infrastructure to sustain, right? Or the members don't have to spend a lot of time that. In the big one, paid staff sustains the big institutional infrastructure, and members come and they do their work of kind of meaning-making. And at the really small house church kind of model, or St. Lydia's Dinner Church in Brooklyn, in those kind of models, there just isn't much to sustain, right? There's not a big overhead. There's not a lot of committees, but these intimate relations of people gathered in prayer, gathered in worship are really profound. So those two models are places where I see vitality in the American church right now. And I'm critical of both of them. The bad part of a house church, it's easy to romanticize that. The bad church is it just becomes a clique that prays together, right? That's happened again and again. Both of these can go wrong. There's nothing magic about them. But it's just to say they're better adjusted to a time of authentic individuals. And they're better adjusted because they're not really voluntary associations anymore. All right, so what can a congregation be, I think, and what can it do? I think congregations can be communities that really work with the pain of individualization, the epidemic of loneliness that we have in our society right now. A committee, inviting somebody to join a committee is one way to deal with loneliness, but it may not be a way that really helps people, right? So to really take seriously the pain of individualization. That shows up in loneliness. The other place it shows up, though, is in just wondering who you are, what your life is for, what it's all about, just to give people space to do that work of identity, do that work of identity making. I didn't really have to wonder about identity very much. I knew what I was supposed to be. I knew what I was supposed to do. You're supposed to grow up and you're supposed to lead voluntary societies for the good of the culture and the glory of God. That was just deeply imprinted in me. That is not there. And it wasn't just my parents, it was a whole culture. But that culture is not there. So we have to figure out how to tell people who they are. And we can't just tell them that who they are is a member of a voluntary association. I think congregations can also be communities that work with the challenges of individualization, that give people space, that thematize this work of an identity. One of the places of pushback that I've wanted to have here, the more I've thought on these shifts, I would have said before, that a Bible study where people are, working on themselves or whatever, that this is narcissistic. This isn't what they need to do is to serve in the voluntary association. But it is not. Just stop and think about it. It is not obvious that serving on the Building and Grounds Committee has more to do with following Jesus than gathering with 12 people and studying the Word of God and asking what it means for our lives, right? It's not obvious that the voluntary association is automatically closer to discipleship. We've got to take seriously these challenges of individualization that our people are living with. And we've also, I think, got to take seriously the intense joys of this individualized existence. It can be emancipatory. One of the things it does is to break the hold of assigned identities, whether those are gendered or raced or whatever. It breaks people out of those. There's some real freedom in that space. So to think what we can do with that freedom. So in my fever dreams, these are some thoughts that I've had about like images to work with as we think about what congregations can be in this kind of order. They might be maker spaces for authentic identities. It might be performance spaces for profound expressive activity. They might be sites for connection with other people engaged in similar work. And they're going to have to be sustained by something other than the donations of members who want to see that voluntary association thrive. It might be that they just have I serve 2 churches in upstate New York. One of them was a voluntary association, and it's been swept away. It grew big time for a while, and then and now it's closed. It's gone away. Classic small voluntary association. The other church that I served, when I went there, it had a budget of $14,000. And it was really less of a voluntary association and more an extended family, an extended kinship network that had been worshiping together at this little crossroads in rural New York for about 200 years. And they're still around. They're indestructible in a way, because they don't, and when I went there, I was, trained in seminary. I was like, I will make you a voluntary association. We will have a committee structure. It will be transparent and accountable. And the grandma of the church, who everybody called grandma, even if she wasn't here, she just was like, oh, honey, you'll understand how we do that. And now her daughter-in-law is grandma, And the kinship network, I'm telling you, the kinship net, because it never was a voluntary association. They didn't even have people would go there for years and they wouldn't be on the rolls. They weren't members. This should drive a Presbyterian heart like mine insane. People were elders when they weren't members. What? But that was the truth of the organization. Do you see what I mean? Those kinds of places are still thriving, and they're very small, but they're not a voluntary association. So there's a lot of things that a congregation can be today. So what does this mean for preaching? I've been very grateful for the invitation to think about this for this lecture. It's not in the books. It's emerging right now, and it's very hard to name it while it's happening. But I thought back to Fred Craddock's great book, As One Without Authority. Craddock's book, As One Without Authority. And I think what Fred Craddock named so astutely was the beginning of the unraveling of the voluntary association. What he saw in the 1970s, what he saw was that simply because he was the Reverend Dr. Fred Craddock, that did not guarantee that he could win a hearing. In fact, if he asserted his Reverend Doctorness in his voice and his mannerisms, in all of that, then he would drive people away. So he had to speak in his language as one without authority. And this is the kind of down-hominess. This is the not using big words, right? This accessibility that he then modeled and embodied in his person too. He's just approachable. You felt like he did in some ways work without the authority of the powerful office. But I've always laughed at that title because I had heard Fred preach before I knew that he had written a book called As One Without Authority. If you heard Fred Craddock preach, you know he preached with extraordinary authority. Extraordinary authority. The thing that he had figured out was that authority in the emerging dispensation did not come from your role in the voluntary association. It came from your ability to manifest an authenticity in public. That's what he was doing. And doing that kind of work requires, in a way, setting aside some of the trappings of the authority of the voluntary association. So I think that move in preaching has, if anything, only become more and more pronounced. You see people increasingly leaning into that authority of authenticity. And this is true in the ways that people speak. It's more conversational now. And if you listen to, especially the preachers that are really connecting with large numbers of younger people, it's super conversational, right? It's not highly structured rhetoric at all. And it's also, it's there in what preachers are wearing. You're not dressing with the office. You would dress in ways that are more everyday. It's there yesterday in the move that I made to step out of the pulpit and to kind of be present in a different sort of way without the trappings of office, but letting you see me, know me in a different way. These are all modelings of authenticity, and preaching without notes is part of doing it with authenticity. It's one thing to have a manuscript that you've memorized, but when we preach without notes, oftentimes, even if it's not more authentic, you can lie without notes. We could point to many examples across the political spectrum on that, but it often feels more authentic, right? It's like somebody who's bound to their teleprompter or bound to their manuscript. It doesn't feel that way. So that's one way that preaching is changing, and that changing has been happening for a long time. Here's another way that I think preaching is evolving in the present times to kind of make sense of this age of authentic individuals. Some of the best preaching I hear right now is not describing signs and wonders or teaching doctrine, like in the standing orders, but it's also not driving for a decision. The kind of preaching that really took off with the voluntary associations almost always ended in a decision, right? This is the classic American altar call. It might seem like that's the way Christian preaching has always ended, but actually it's an invention of the late 18th century that became dominant in the 19th and through the 20th centuries. Preaching has to end with a decision. And now I love in liberal congregations that when I visit there, that would be like never think they have an altar call. There is an altar call. It's just an altar call to join the movement, right? Or an altar call to recycle more or whatever it is. There's an altar call to be more inclusive. That logic of the altar call, of preaching that demands a decision, is just so baked into the voluntary association form. But across the centuries, there are many modes of Christian preaching that are not driving towards a decision, that are doing something different. One of those that has been very formative in my own life is monastic preaching. Monastic preaching in the Benedictine community that I love, those guys are together. They've all taken vows for life. They're together every morning. They hear a sermon every day. They all know each other. Nobody needs to persuade anybody of anything, right? They're not driving towards a decision. And if they were, it'd be just exhausting, right? What they're doing in those sermons, though, are just meditations on Scripture as it's unfolded in the world in which they live. It's one of my monk friends, I asked him, he gave this beautiful sermon, and I asked him how he prepared, and he said, well, I just do Lectio Divina, this practice of sacred reading, and then I stand up and talk to my brothers, and then I sit down. Like, that's what preaching is, right? It's just oral Lectio. So it's not driving towards a decision. It's more contemplative. It's opening up this space, a sacred space, where the text is at the center and people can move in it. I also think, and this is for better and worse. Again, don't hear enthusiasm or a marketing plan from me. But I think there's a lot of preaching today that resonates with people, that is really trying to help them with the work of being an individualized individual. It's really speaking directly to that challenge. Some of this is in churches. I saw just the other day a sermon by Judah Smith, a preacher who has a kind of a little celebrity kind of clique around him, but it was called "It's Just Me." But his, the style was all very 2023, the style of dress. But really, what he was doing was just trying to say you can accept yourself the way you are. Right? It was a classic message to an individualized individual. And I think in a more secular or semi-secular mode, Brene Brown, her TED Talk that's had like 1 billion views, she does this too. It's a speaking to people in this work of putting together a self, putting together an identity. And it doesn't all of these are more meditative. They don't necessarily lead to a decision. They don't culminate in a big call for a decision. They more open up a space in which people can put the pieces together. A third thing that I see, and this is closely related, and this is more a wonder or a hope. I am, with the voluntary associations, preaching really became instrumentalized, by which I mean people thought that a sermon was supposed to do something. It was supposed to be effective. It was supposed to change people's minds and mobilize them to get out there and serve on a committee or give more or give their lives to Christ or start recycling or whatever, but it was meant to be effective. And so we would shape preaching to try to make it a more effective instrument. There's this deep instrumentalizing of it that happens. That would have been very weird to a Puritan preacher. They weren't trying to be effective in that sense. It would be very weird to a monastic preacher. That's not a desire towards effectiveness. But to a contemporary, to somebody nurtured in the voluntary associations, of course a sermon has to be effective. Of course it has to move people to make a decision. So one of the things I'm very intrigued about is the possibility of sermons that are not as concerned with that instrumentalized ethos. And this would be the sermon that is, we've instrumentalized the sacraments too. You'll be in a worship committee meeting in a voluntary association and people will be like, we got to figure out how to serve communion so that we get it done pretty quickly so we can get it, it has to be efficient and we have to give people a high-grade spiritual experience. So then we're going to instrumentalize the way we serve to do that. But even we're not that far fallen, right? Around our sacraments, we'll have a different ethos. It's still there. And the core of that ethos is it is good in itself to do this. What Jared said yesterday from behind that table, this is the meaning of life. When it's that's right. And when it's the meaning of life, it's not a means to some other end. This is the end itself. This is what it's all about. We can get there, I think, at the table. What if we thought that about preaching too? What if we had a non-instrumentalized, more sacramental, more a stronger sense that preaching is an end in itself, and that it's good to do just because it is good to dwell in the Word together? That's something I could hope for. I see non-instrumental preaching. I don't hear much of that, honestly, that really sacramental account of preaching. I don't hear much of that outside of the best day at a monastery. But here's some places where I do see non-instrumental preaching that is very interesting to me, and that I think you can see it resonating. One of them is in the ecstatic preaching of Pentecostal denominations, especially in the purer forms, when the preacher really goes off, and the whole congregation gets there. That moment of ecstasy is not a means to something else. That's it. That's what it's all about. It's about being in that place where you are caught up in praise. It's being swept away. That's what it's all for. You don't do that and then say, hey, you've just had this great experience, and boy, have we got a committee for you, right? That would be terrible. You're not going to instrumentalize it in that way. And when they do instrumentalize it towards money, hey, let's keep the blessings flowing, it feels it's a deep corruption. It's terrible. But that ecstatic moment, which is what people really want, it's a non-instrumental purpose of preaching. That's really interesting to me. Here's another place where I see it, and that's in some contemporary black church preaching that really celebrates the virtuosic. So somebody will just drop a great line or go on this incredible riff, and you can see people in the congregation just like, oh, you know what? And they're just delighting in the person's rhetorical gifts being used for the glory of God. But it's a virtuosic performance, but it's not harnessed necessarily to any instrumental good. There's just a corporate delighting in the virtuosity. All right, so whether it's sacramental or ecstatic or virtuosic, I think there are multiple modes of non-instrumentalized preaching that I think could fit the times, and I think could be gifts to the church. So here's another thing that I think about, and a lot on these kinds of questions. I'm interested in how people tell stories in the middle of sermons. How people tell stories. As long as there has been Christian preaching, and even before, people have told stories when they have preached, right? We've always told stories. But the stories are doing very different things. The great Puritan preacher Jonathan Edwards kept a notebook of what he thought of as the illuminations of God in the world. And in one of these, say, he would talk about walking up a hill, and as he walks up the hill, he gradually sees more and more of the sky. And he says, this is a way that God is teaching me about the nature of revelation. It is a walk up a hill. Now, the crucial thing is, Edwards does not live in a secularized universe where walking up the hill is like revelation. No, he means it very literally. Walking up the hill and gradually seeing more of the sky, that's how God made the world so that God could teach Jonathan Edwards on that walk about revelation. Do you see what I mean? The world is shot through with sacred meaning, so stories don't have to point to some meaning beyond themselves. Well, with the rise of natural science, and nobody believes, Edwards is like the last person who finds that compelling, right? So preachers in the 19th century are really, really different. And what do they start doing? They start telling stories that kind of have a moral to them. The story has a point. You know this kind of sermon story? I'll tell you the story, and then at the end of it, there's going to be some takeaway item. I think those kind of stories, they're all like Aesop's fables, right? And then they kind of get to the point. I think Fred Craddock's stories, and he was, one of the great storytelling preachers of the last century. To me, they don't resolve easily into a point. And it's another way in which I think he was ahead of his time, pointing towards a next kind of thing. I wonder what it would be like for us to preach stories that are saturated with the presence of God and that don't necessarily resolve in a simple point. I imagine for many listeners, those would be frustrating. What are you doing, preacher? What am I supposed to get from that story? But if the story is rich enough and deep enough, it could be really powerful. Think about a novel but it's not just novels, it's also long-form podcasts, or it's like This American Life, right? If you listen, think about the difference between This American Life and A Prairie Home Companion, if you know these references. Garrison Keillor stories were shot through with nostalgia, and they often kind of ended in a clear takeaway, a clear point. There was a tidiness to them. This American Life doesn't have that, right? It's just like, hey, here's this sprawl of life, but you feel the profundity of it. So what would it be like if you told that kind of story, but with a theological angle of vision that was describing the work of God in the world? It's just a rich enough story that you can get lost in it, you can move around in it, and as you move around in it, you find God. All right, so those are some possibilities, I think, for preaching in this age of authentic individuals. In the end, I'm committed, and the whole source of my hope, the whole reason I'm standing here now, is that I do not think that history and sociology get the last word. Whatever we are doing, we've got to do it with the consciousness that we're preaching not just between the times of voluntary associations and an age of authentic individuals. We're preaching between the times that Bart taught us about, to preaching between the times of the resurrection of Christ and the great wedding feast of the Lamb, between what God has already done, the promises God has already made, and the fulfillment of those promises. So the beginning and the end of the story in which we live, these are already sure and certain. And because we trust in them, we can trust that the Word of God will be proclaimed in and in spite of us, even in these times between the times, and in all times to come, until the end of time. Thanks be to God. All right. Well, we've got maybe 10 minutes for questions, and I'd love to have them from you. Or they can be questions, or you can also just say, think about this, you're missing this. You don't have to frame it as a question, please.
With their play.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's not, that's not original to me. I didn't make that one up. So, yeah, it is my favorite by far, and I go to it again and again. I think the feast image, the feast on the mountain, on the holy mountain where the calf and when the child, the lion, I'm really tired, where the lion and lamb can lie down together and the child can play over the adder's den. That place of safety and feasting and the nearness of God. I think that's another image that we can get. I think, Jesus gives us images for this all the time in the Gospels for what that would be. So the mustard seed, the seed growing secretly, these are other ways that I would think about that. It's a great question, though. How do we make that language resonant?
about the anticipating is it? Because wish with of interest in alien life.
Yeah, that's a great question. What about the interest in a return and about alien life? To me, the great interest in alien life and UFOs is one more sign of the times that, look, we are not in some kind of super secular age, right? Where people will only believe things they have evidence for. This is not the case, right? I think that, I kind of roll my eyes at some of these desires, but I also, where I think it's coming from is a sense that the world is, so, and that is correct, that the world is, you'll pardon my Calvinism here, but the world is fallen to a degree that we can't save ourselves. And there's going to have to be some kind of action from beyond us to set the world right. I think that's the correct intuition of those moments. And I would want to honor that and work with that. And in a question and answer with a person, say, why do you need that? Or why is that interesting? But I think that's what it is. It's a sense, other people, that interest takes the form of a revolutionary impulse. We got to burn it all down and start from scratch. It's that sense that it's going to take more than is present in the present moment to save us. And I think there's some correct insights into that. What it misses is the now and not yet of Christian eschatology, which wants to say both we can't save ourselves and God is already present at work in this world, right?
And as a those great
Yeah.
singers. Well, still.
Amen. Yeah, and I think we would do well to nurture again that kind of hunger in people, or to honor the hunger that's already there. One of the things I worry about with the way preaching and with the larger church life has gone is when it turns into a series of moral directives, which is what has happened in the age of voluntary associations. Then you got to do this, you got to do that, and when you come hear a sermon, basically what you're being told is you need to make a decision to do these things better, right? And it's kind of, even if God is invoked, but really it's all up to us. We got to figure these things out. It's lost that sense that we can't complete it, right? And so a hunger, a waiting for something that we can't do is, I think, an essential part of that piety.
God is like a very abstract, a notion or concept. I think maybe God is kind of alien because a intelligence beyond us. Because at the time when the Bible was written, people did not have such knowledge.
Yeah.
And maybe this is not contradictory to each other. Maybe we can reconcile, with alien life and a God.
Yeah.
So I think, sometimes I think because the concept of God is so abstract. So when I think that maybe aliens, they have more power and above us, this is what people think a long time ago as God. So I think that this maybe help some congregants to understand the concept of God. And, we are so small, That's what I think.
Yeah.
What's your take?
Well, I think the deep part of what you're saying that I agree with is that God is not like us and that God is alien to us in some way. And so we need to kind of try to figure that. My problem with most conceptions of aliens, quote unquote, like in pop culture and stuff, is that they're just not weird enough. They're just way too much like us, right? And God is not kind of like us, but just a little more moral and a little more powerful, and maybe with a different facial figuration, or no. The difference between us and God is vaster than that can help us imagine. So I want to hold on to that. The risk of that vision of God is that it can become very abstract. And I think for the church, this is where the main way we resist that is to point to the person of Jesus. And we say, this is where we see this God who is completely other to us revealed. And then we also learn, wow, when this God walks among us, it's unbearable for us. And the powers of this world will do all they can to kill it. Why should we expect otherwise? Yeah.
Hello. I was interested in your description of kind of the preparation process for some of the more meaningful sermons you've heard recently, like the Lectio Divina. Some of the contemplative practices seem to be popular and helpful, especially right now. And recently I was talking to another minister about some kind of contemplative spirituality, and I mentioned that I had recently had an experience with two-way journaling that's kind of more from the Pentecostal tradition. And there was an immediate whoa, pump the brakes. Lectio Divina is okay, but two-way journaling is irresponsible. And I just found that kind of interesting reaction from this other minister, especially in light of what you were saying, a lot of churches in the global south that probably do have more Pentecostal influence are the ones growing, but yet maybe there is more of a spirit focus than a scripture focus. But is there some concern, or I don't know, how would you have responded to that?
Sure. This is the thing. There is no practice, no devotional practice that cannot be corrupted. And history teaches us this, right? So there's ways that any of these things could go wrong. What I would want to know, say with the two-way journaling, it doesn't mean that they're all equal. We would want to evaluate them. What I'd want to know with the two-way journaling is what kind of, following Jesus, by their fruits you shall know them. What kind of fruits is it bearing in the life of these individuals and communities? And that would begin to tell us about what's happening in that journaling process. But I wouldn't be closed to it automatically. I am, for me the canon is closed, and Scripture has a different kind of weight. And I think that's not just a kind of, for me, that's my personal preference. I think that's what orthodoxy is, right? The canon is closed, so that's going to be different than I'm going to have my kind of revelation. Yeah, I'm just being real with you. But I don't think two-way journaling has to involve an expansion of the canon. I think it can be a profound kind of dwelling together with the text. Yeah, so
So I'd like to pick up on the continuum between the already and the not yet, and to identify first that I think a lot of modern Christians live more towards the not yet side, in which they think the big eschatological event is still to come, which is the second coming. And in the meantime, we just kind of wait. And often we wait passively then. And my sense is that the New Testament writers, and maybe much of early Christianity, at least up to Constantine, lived much more on the already end of the spectrum, in which they thought the definitive apocalyptic moment had already happened in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, which signaled the end of the powers of sin and death.
Yeah.
And so what Jesus talks about then, as kind of a primary spiritual practice towards the end of his ministry, is he tells his disciples to stay awake and to watch. And I think that business of staying awake and watching should be understood as a central spiritual discipline for individuals and congregations. And I think it actually fits very well with the kind of instrumental preaching.
Yeah.
Maybe our job is to help Christians like today, like Jesus helped his disciples, learn to live in the present, attending to the ways that God has already broken into our world and continues to do so in the least expected spaces.
Amen. And let me do the yes and of improv comedy. So yes, I agree. I agree with all of that, and wholeheartedly. I might here's the and I would offer. Someone like Lyman Beecher, who is just ground zero for or Charles Finney, ground zero for the consciousness of the voluntary association. They were thoroughgoing post-millennials, by which what that means is they thought that they put the emphasis on the reign of God is not yet here, but how is it going to come? We've got to work to make it come, right? And so we're going to work. So there was this incredible dynamism, though, that came out of that desire. We have to bring in the reign of God. So they weren't the quietists who were like, oh, God will do it, whatever. They were, no, it's really that post-millennial energy that created America. I don't think it's too strong to say that, right? And the network of voluntary associations. So I think one of the crises that we have right now is that people don't have that post-millennial faith anymore. The post-millennialism is the engine that drives the voluntary network of voluntary associations. But most people today aren't, whether for good theological reasons or bad ones, they're not going to believe that we can bring in the kingdom anymore. So what you get is this kind of exhaustion from trying to sustain institutions that were built to do that, when we don't really even believe that it could happen anymore, right? Because but that's not all bad. There were theological flaws in that. What they lost was the now, the alreadiness. So I think there is a kind of good correction to turn back to the alreadiness of reconciliation, the alreadiness of salvation. Yeah. These are great questions. It's fun.
When you're ready to quit, feel free to do so. If you want to entertain more questions, we shall.
It's 12:09. We started a little late. How about and I want to honor your time as well. One way I want to honor your time is saying if you need to leave, please feel free to go ahead, and no offense taken. But I think we could go maybe 2 more questions. Shall we say that? 2 more.
We all know the incredible growth of Peachtree Presbyterian Church. I know that church, and I know they no longer call themselves Peachtree Presbyterian Church, but Peachtree Church. Now, is that following the model of the non-denominational church, and they feel like people don't have to buy into particular do's and don'ts of the Presbyterian Church? Or is that just a desperate cry to stay relevant and to be able to pay the bills?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't want to answer it about Peachtree Presbyterian in particular, but let me answer it about they're not the only ones who've made this move. It's a very, very common move that has been made. Really, I mean, we have denomination splitting, and then we also have people. And the interesting thing is, and this is what when these denominations are breaking up, one of the ways you can see that it's a weakening of the denominational form. And remember, the denomination is a signature of the era of voluntary associations, is that what we're not seeing as much now are 2 denominations, or at least not 2 without remainder. Much more common is that there is a new denomination, but a lot of the churches that leave the old denomination don't go to it. They go off on their own. And that is where, even when churches are still in denominations, as more and more of the members cluster into a few large congregations, what's happening on the ground already, I think, is a breakup of denominations and a move towards almost the kind of second century model of really powerful cathedral churches that have networks of influence. Sometimes those are mediated through old denominational structures, and sometimes it's more overt, like Hillsong or something, or Saddleback. They'll franchise you, right, with those networks, but they're not a denomination. I think where this fits with the story that I was trying to tell about the age of authenticity is it's the direction of the flow of meaning. So I think, say, for my parents' generation, and I use them as a kind of stand-in for true believers born and bred to the voluntary association, for them, being Presbyterian was just supremely important to their identity. Supremely important, very important. And if the church made a policy they didn't agree with, which happened all the time, they would be furious and they would fight it, but they wouldn't leave because that identity was too important to them. And I think one of the things that has happened with that's what you do if the voluntary association is the anchor of God's presence in the world, right? If that voluntary association has that kind of meaning. But if the voluntary association is really a place where you get to express yourself, and then the denomination doesn't match the way you want to express yourself, well, then you just go. And you don't worry about it a lot. The great sociologist Robert Wuthnow named a rise of this in his book, The Restructuring of American Religion. And what he talked about were the rise of what he called special purpose groups within denominations. I don't know what they are within disciples. I'm sure you have them. For the Presbyterian Church, it was like more like Presbyterian on the sexuality issue, more like Presbyterians on one side, the confessing church on the other, whatever the names are. But these were like lobby groups that arose within the church to then try to argue over the middle. And so Wuthnow was noting this and seeing that it's really interesting. He was right to note it, and what I think has happened in the couple of decades since he wrote his book is that basically denominations have become special purpose groups. They don't have that big, they're not big tents anymore that include all kinds, or they barely are, right? Mostly now they reflect the views of a base kind of community that is pretty homogeneous. They reflect the expressions of those folks. And so I think like Peachtree Pres and other congregations that have left their denominations, it's partly just, it's because the denominational ethos doesn't have the aura that it had in the past, so they feel free to leave, and it's a kind of rationalizing so that the church is more expressive of what the individuals want, or what they want to, of who they think they are, politically, theologically, and otherwise.
I think that the annual conventions, the yearly convention of the different major denominations serve to unify the church or to fracture the church?
I think that's a great question. I think they became the theater in which these the work of expressive identities, gradually authentic identities, gradually overwhelming the old denominational ethos of a voluntary association. They're the place where that happened, and that drama was acted out in those places. I say it in the past tense. It's mostly done now. The denominations have largely consolidated a long line. I mean, it breaks my heart that the church had a chance to be a countercultural witness in the culture wars of the United States. And what we ended up doing was breaking in ways that we just replicate the powers of the culture. It's we just missed a chance to do something to witness to the gospel, right?
Do you want to say something, please?
Yeah, you can't let us end on we missed a chance to witness to the gospel. Come on, Jared. Bring us home in a happier way.
Okay, well, listen, I appreciate you personally. I will say this. One time I had to do a funeral for a 30-year-old woman who had drowned up at Lake Lanier, and the body was yet to be discovered. And I didn't know how to preach that funeral. I called Reverend Dr. Ted Smith, and he just said, well, there is only a story in Scripture about there being grief without a body. And just a small word opened and unlocked my spiritual imagination. Like Lectio Divina, God speaks to us through other people. Amen?
Amen.
And since I think what we're doing here is part of the meaning of life and not instrumentalized, let's end with a word of praise. Is that okay?
Amen. Yeah.
Reverend Bell, would you lead us in the doxology? Everyone stand, and we'll close with a word of praise.